Karen Grassle was seen as the emotional core of Little House on the Prairie, the steady presence, the gentle mother audiences trusted. She represented calm and warmth in every episode. But off camera, something was deeply wrong. For years, she said nothing. Not while the show was airing, not in the decades that followed. She carried it alone, even when it nearly destroyed her. Now, at 82 years old, she is finally speaking out about what Michael Landon did and why she remained silent for so long. To millions of viewers throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Karen Grassle was Caroline Ingalls, the soft-spoken, endlessly patient frontier mother. She embodied grace, compassion, and quiet strength. For a long time, the public believed that role reflected who Karen was in real life. But as she now admits, the reality behind the scenes was far more complicated. Karen wasn't just portraying a long-suffering mother on screen, she was living it. She was navigating a male-dominated set and enduring the power dynamics that came with it. Much of that pressure came from one person, Michael Landon. At the time, no one suspected a problem. Karen and Michael were the faces of the show, appearing side by side in promotional photos, smiling through cast interviews, and delivering performances that moved audiences week after week. Their on-screen chemistry was undeniable. Behind the scenes, however, the power imbalance was clear. Michael Landon wasn't just the star of Little House on the Prairie. He was also the creator, head writer, executive producer, and often the director. He controlled nearly every aspect of the production. In her memoir, Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, Karen later revealed that the public image of Landon as a kind, fatherly figure was largely a myth. For years, Karen chose silence. She didn't challenge the glowing reputation Landon had with fans. But that silence came at a cost. While Landon played a devoted husband on screen, his treatment of Karen off-screen was at times belittling. In the early seasons, she was paid significantly less than Landon and several of her male co-stars, an imbalance she endured quietly for years. When Karen finally asked for a pay raise after the show became a major success, Michael Landon's response was anything but encouraging. There was no support, no understanding, only a clear signal that her request was not welcome. According to Karen, that moment marked a turning point. Her character began to change. Emotional scenes disappeared. Important moments were quietly removed. Her presence on the show was slowly reduced, not enough to cause public attention, but enough to remind her who truly held the power. The humiliation didn't happen on camera. It happened behind closed doors, during script discussions, on set, disguised as jokes that crossed boundaries and comments meant to belittle. Karen recalls that Michael would make crude, unnecessary remarks, even while filming intimate scenes. Delivered with a smirk, they felt intentional, as if he were saying, "This is the price you pay for asking for more." Still, she didn't leave. Like many women in Hollywood at that time, Karen had learned to endure, to stay quiet, to choose carefully when, and if, to speak up. She knew how hard she had worked to earn that role. She understood how rare it was for a woman over 30 to hold a central place on a primetime drama. So she smiled, showed up, delivered her lines, and locked the rest away for decades. Now, at 82, she is finally ready to tell her story. Not out of bitterness. Not to tear down a legacy. But because the truth matters, and because carrying it in silence for so long took a heavy toll. And what she reveals next is even more troubling. When Little House on the Prairie first premiered in 1974, Karen believed she had found her dream job. The scripts felt heartfelt. The set seemed welcoming. And Michael Landon, already famous from Bonanza, appeared charming, funny, and deeply invested in the show's success. But Karen wasn't blind to reality. From the start, she understood that this was Michael's world. He wasn't just the lead actor. He controlled the creative direction, had final say over scripts, casting, and storylines. In the early seasons, that imbalance didn't explode into open conflict, but it lingered quietly in the background. As the show hit its stride and popularity soared, Karen's role as Ma became essential to its emotional core. Audiences connected with her. The network took notice. Ratings climbed. Yet one thing stayed exactly the same: her salary. While Michael negotiated lucrative deals and production benefits, Karen remained bound to her original contract, far below what she knew she deserved. And when she finally pushed back, asking for fair compensation, the response was immediate. Michael didn't shout. He didn't issue threats. Instead, he chose a quieter, colder form of punishment. According to Karen, Michael Landon used the scripts as his weapon. Scenes were suddenly rewritten. Caroline's dialogue was trimmed down. Family dinner moments that once carried warmth and depth were reduced to brief exchanges. And most noticeably, Landon's character began to carry the emotional weight of the episodes, while Karen's presence slowly faded into the background. It wasn't subtle. And it wasn't accidental. Karen later said it felt like punishment, for speaking up, for negotiating, for forgetting that her role on that set wasn't truly equal. She understood the message clearly. The irony was impossible to ignore. On screen, she played a mother holding her family together through hardship. Off-screen, she was quietly absorbing humiliation. And it didn't stop with the writing. Behind the scenes, Landon's sense of humor changed. What once felt light-hearted became pointed. Karen has said he made crude remarks in front of the crew, especially during scenes that required physical closeness. On one particular day, while preparing for a romantic moment between Charles and Caroline, Landon reportedly made a joke about her body, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room laughed. Karen didn't. She smiled. She did her job. She kept going. Because what choice did she have? Speak up? Walk away from the most visible role of her career? Karen had trained for years as a serious actress. Shakespeare, theater, dramatic roles. This part had finally given her national recognition, and she feared that calling out Landon, the show's beloved figurehead, would only make her seem like the problem. That was what haunted her most. It wasn't only the insults. It wasn't just the unequal pay. It was the fact that she swallowed it all and acted as if it didn't matter. Every time she stood beside Landon in interviews and praised him publicly, she felt she was betraying herself. It's no surprise she stayed silent. Speaking out back then would have ended her career. She was facing a man adored by audiences, shielded by producers, and far too powerful to challenge. So she waited, quietly, carefully, until years after the cameras stopped rolling and long after Michael Landon was gone. That was when she finally chose to speak. And what she revealed next stunned even those who believed they already knew the story. 4 years, Karen Grassle avoided interviews. She skipped cast reunions. She distanced herself from headlines that portrayed Little House on the Prairie as flawless, with a perfect cast and a perfect legacy. But when she turned 80, something shifted. She began to write. Her memoir, Bright Lights, Prairie Dust, was not meant as an exposé. It was intended to tell her full story. Her childhood, her struggles, her rise to fame, and the complicated cost that fame carried. But as the book took shape, Karen realized there was one truth she could no longer avoid: the way Michael Landon had treated her and how deeply it had hurt her. It was a pain she had buried for decades. At first, Karen told herself the past wasn't worth reopening. Over time, she even convinced herself that maybe it hadn't been as bad as she remembered. But once she began writing, the memories returned with startling clarity, especially the one that ultimately compelled her to speak. It happened during a tense contract negotiation. Karen had finally gathered the courage to ask for fair compensation, equal pay, or at least something closer to it. She wasn't asking for Michael Landon's millions. She simply wanted a raise that reflected her importance to the show and her popularity with viewers. What followed, she says, was deeply unsettling. After the negotiations failed, something shifted in their shared scenes. The change was subtle, but impossible to miss. During one emotional on-screen kiss between Charles and Caroline, Landon reportedly altered the moment entirely. He leaned in for the kiss in a way that felt exaggerated, performative, and completely different from how they had rehearsed it. To Karen, it felt deliberate, a signal, a warning. You're replaceable. And the message landed. She didn't report it to producers. She didn't raise concerns with the crew. She knew the system wouldn't protect her. It never had. In her memoir, Karen describes that moment as one of the lowest points of her career. Not because of the kiss itself, but because of the humiliation that followed, the realization that she had no leverage, no support, no safety net. Just a forced smile and the next page of the script. What came after was even more troubling. Karen recalls that Landon, despite being married, openly flirted with women on set, sometimes even in front of their children. He joked about women's bodies, their voices, the way they dressed. And because he was in charge, no one challenged him. Karen witnessed it all and remained silent. She had learned early that speaking up meant being labeled difficult, a reputation that could end a career in the 1970s, especially for a woman nearing 40. But silence carries a cost. Over the years, Karen carried that weight into every audition, every interview, every public appearance. Writing her memoir forced her to face it, to recognize how much she had endured and how little credit she had given herself for surviving. And when the book was finally released, something unexpected happened. People believed her. Fans stood by her. Even those who had never questioned Michael Landon's carefully crafted image began to notice the cracks. For Karen, it was never about retaliation. It was about honesty and healing. She wasn't trying to erase anyone's legacy, but she was no longer willing to protect someone who had made her feel insignificant for so long. The truth, she said, had waited long enough. What many didn't realize, however, was that Karen's story wasn't finished. There was still one moment, one letter, that changed everything before Michael Landon's death. And that's where the story takes an unexpected turn. By the late 1980s, Little House on the Prairie had been off the air for several years. The cast had long since gone their separate ways, and the world had moved on. But for Karen Grassle, the past never fully settled. The memories remained, unfinished, unspoken, unresolved. Then came the news that froze her in place. Michael Landon had been diagnosed with cancer, a rare and aggressive form, and the outlook was grim. To those who knew Karen's history, the reaction seemed predictable, that she might feel justified, even relieved, seeing the man who had hurt her brought down by fate. But that wasn't what she felt. Instead, Karen felt sorrow. No matter what had happened between them, Michael had been deeply woven into her life. For nearly 10 years, they had worked side by side. They shared tears in emotional scenes, laughter between takes, and helped create a series that still meant everything to millions of people. And now, he was dying. Karen struggled with what to do next. One part of her wanted to stay silent, as she always had. But another part, the part that had quietly grieved a connection that never truly existed, knew this was her final opportunity. So she wrote him a letter. It wasn't angry. It wasn't accusatory. It was a letter meant to bring peace. In her memoir, Karen recalls the moment in vivid detail. She sat alone at her kitchen table, pen resting in her hand, uncertain where to begin. The words were difficult to find. How do you write to someone who once caused you pain, yet shared so much of your life? Eventually, the words came. She thanked him for the chance he gave her, for casting her, for trusting her, for allowing her to reach millions of households. Even though the cost had been silence. And she told him she forgave him. She didn't catalog every hurt or revisit every insult. Instead, she wrote from a place of closure, one it had taken her decades to reach. Karen sent the letter and waited. She didn't expect a response. She wasn't even sure Michael would see it. But not long after, she heard through someone close to him. He had read her letter, and he cried. It was among the last messages he received before his death. For Karen, that was enough. It didn't undo the past. It didn't change what had happened. But it gave her something she never thought she'd have: peace. She carried that moment quietly for years. She didn't share it publicly. She didn't use it for attention or drama, until her memoir. And even then, she told it carefully, gently, aware that the version of Michael Landon fans loved still lived on in their memories. She wasn't trying to tear that image down. She only wanted to add a footnote, a truth. Her truth. That even the most admired figures have flaws. That even strong women carry lasting scars. And that sometimes, a letter written in silence can heal decades of pain. What happened after the book's release, however, surprised even Karen. The response wasn't just empathy. It was shock, anger, and a long-delayed reckoning with the legacy of one of television's most untouchable figures. And soon, others were drawn in. Former cast members who, like Karen, had remained silent for years. When Karen Grassle's memoir reached bookstores, it landed quietly but powerfully. There were no explosive headlines or scandal-filled press tours, just the steady unveiling of a story that had waited more than 40 years to be told. Yet the impact was immediate. Fans of Little House on the Prairie, many of whom had grown up idolizing Michael Landon, felt shaken, not by Karen's honesty, but by the realization that their childhood hero may have fostered a culture of fear and disrespect behind the scenes. Audiences had watched him portray the ideal father week after week, never stopping to question what lay behind that image. But once Karen spoke out, the questions began to surface. And it became clear she wasn't the only one who had stayed silent. In the months after her book was released, former cast and crew members slowly began to talk, some openly, others in quiet, off-the-record conversations. While their experiences didn't all mirror Karen's exactly, a clear pattern emerged. Stories surfaced of a set that was far less wholesome than it appeared on screen. Some admitted they had always sensed tension between Karen and Michael but were too afraid to get involved. Others remembered Landon's temper when things didn't go his way, and how he often disguised control and criticism as humor. Off-color jokes were common. So were public reprimands, especially toward anyone who challenged him, women in particular. Even Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura Ingalls and has long spoken fondly of Landon, has acknowledged the contradictions in his personality. She admired him deeply, but never denied that he could be emotionally manipulative, especially when his authority was questioned. What set Karen Grassle apart was that she was the first to put it in writing, to stand alone, clearly name what happened, and publish it for the world to read. And for that, she faced both praise and backlash. Some accused her of trying to damage the reputation of a man who could no longer defend himself. Others dismissed her as bitter, jealous, or desperate for attention. But those who understood the era she worked in, and the power structures of 1970s Hollywood, recognized the deeper truth. Karen's story was never just about Michael Landon. It was about a system that allowed charismatic men to operate without accountability. A system where women who spoke up were ignored or punished, while men who crossed boundaries were protected and praised. It was a system where actresses were expected to smile through insults, absorb humiliation, and treat it as part of the job. Karen Grassle lived that reality. And she never painted Landon as a villain. She described him carefully, as a man full of contradictions, warm and generous one moment, cold and retaliatory the next. Karen gave Michael Landon credit where it belonged. She acknowledged his skill, his charisma, and even his generosity when it appeared. But she no longer softened the rest. Not anymore. And that honesty created space for others to come forward, not just in Hollywood, but across industries and generations. Women who had stayed silent for years began to recognize their own experiences in hers. They were inspired by someone who waited until she had nothing left to prove, then spoke with clarity and conviction. In that sense, Karen Grassle's memoir became more than a personal account. It sparked a larger conversation about the stories we protect, the heroes we defend, and the truths we eventually have to face. For those who still viewed Michael Landon as an untouchable symbol of television's golden era, Karen's revelations posed a difficult question. If the father figure we trusted on screen wasn't who he seemed, what other realities have we chosen to overlook? By the time Karen reached her 80s, most of her peers had long since stepped away from the spotlight. Little House on the Prairie belonged to another era. Michael Landon was gone. Fans had grown older, and media attention had largely faded. But for Karen, something remained unsettled. For decades, she had been praised as the poised, elegant, steady presence on the show. Rarely did anyone ask what that role demanded of her, emotionally and personally. After her memoir was released, interview requests followed slowly. But Karen never sought the spotlight. When she did speak, she did so with the same calm dignity that once defined her portrayal of Caroline Ingalls. She didn't shout her story. She told it with care, reflection, and restraint. And in doing so, she reshaped how she would be remembered. She was no longer seen only as the actress who played Ma. She became a voice for a generation of women who had endured silence under power, and were finally finding the courage to speak. The irony is that Karen Grassle never wanted to be at the center of controversy. For years, she declined chances to tell her side. She allowed Michael Landon's reputation to remain untouched, even knowing the full truth. And when asked about him publicly, she repeated the familiar lines. He was kind. He was talented. He made people laugh. All of that was true, just not complete. And that realization is what finally moved her to speak. Not to condemn, not to shame, but to finish the story. To add her voice to a narrative that had always been told from someone else's perspective. She wasn't seeking sympathy. She wanted honesty. In doing so, she offered fans something more meaningful than nostalgia. She offered truth. Michael Landon remains a complicated figure in television history. Brilliant, charismatic, driven, and deeply flawed. Karen Grassle didn't erase his legacy. She broadened it. She asked the public to hold two realities at once, that he was a visionary, and that he could also be cruel. And she went further. Using the momentum of her memoir, Karen began supporting causes close to her heart, including mental health resources for women in entertainment and advocacy for fair treatment on sets. She appeared not as a victim, but as a survivor, not as a resentful actress, but as a woman who endured something painful and emerged stronger because of it. Her story is not meant as a warning, it's a demand for accountability. A reminder that while silence can be a means of survival, truth is a form of freedom. For decades, Karen Grassle stayed quiet. She smiled when it was required. She showed up, did the work, and never allowed the world to see her fracture. Yet behind that composed, familiar face was a woman carrying years of disrespect, inequality, and quiet humiliation. Now, at 82, she is no longer preserving the myth. She is claiming her truth. And fans, many of whom once admired Michael Landon without question, are finally seeing the complete picture. Because sometimes, the most powerful voices are the ones that waited the longest to be heard. If this story stayed with you, the next one will stay with you even longer. Watch it now.